When selecting things to grow in the gardens, I tend to lean towards types of vegetables and different varieties that are vigorous and robust. I think a lot of this is simply based on the idea that strong is better, that robust and vigorous plants are better able to get what they need from the soil, to grow quickly, and to produce in abundance. And these are things that I want to get out of the gardens most of the time, and in many situations, more vigorous plants can be really beneficial, but I am learning that it really does depend on context. For example, I have been exploring a diverse range of courgette or zucchini varieties for growing in the sheltered conditions of the polytunnel. And some of the varieties grew way too big, and I had to stop the trial early. But I did find some interesting possibilities in varieties that are the opposite of vigorous. In the vegetable gardens, there is often a struggle to find a balance between growing as much as possible and giving individual plants more space. This is one of the key differences between some of the family scale gardens that I'm trialing, with some focusing on productivity through higher density planting, and others allowing enough space to ensure plants are not stressed or struggle too much with competition. In the polytunnels, I generally try to get as much out of the high value space as I can. But within the sheltered and warmer microclimate, the plants can get too big, and I often rely on pruning and controlling the plants in particular ways so that they do not overwhelm each other and take over the space. And this is something that I've done in the past with courgette and zucchini plants in the polytunnels, pruning the older leaves, cutting out any side shoots, and trying to find ways to support them vertically so that they will be able to produce in abundance for longer in the season. I have been growing the same hybrid variety of courgettes for a while now, one that I originally selected more by chance than anything. And I've continued to grow that one variety year after year in all the gardens, mainly so that it would be easier to compare the harvests and issues in the different gardens and in different years. But I've wanted to explore other varieties to better understand the differences between the different types. And it's unlikely that the variety that I randomly selected a couple of years ago is the best for this context, especially in the polytunnel. 2 years ago, I bought seeds for a load of different courgette varieties, both hybrid and open pollinated, some conventional and some quite unusual, and I planted one of each variety as an intercrop between climbing beans. It wasn't the best context for a trial, but I learned a fair amount, and I wanted to repeat the trial with a slightly reduced selection of varieties, to better understand the possible range and how they grew, their habit or form, the taste, and how productive they could be. I wanted to find varieties that work well in the calm and warmer microclimate of the polytunnel, which I could control effectively so that they didn't take over the space, and produced a high yield of the types of courgettes that people like to eat. I sowed the seeds on the 21st of April and transplanted the courgette plants of 9 different varieties in the polytunnel bed a couple of weeks later, spacing the plants about 1 meter apart. I let all of the plants grow without pruning the older leaves or removing any side or secondary growing shoots to see how they would develop, but I regretted that decision later. All the plants grew well, and the first smaller courgettes were harvested from some of the plants 44 days after sowing, while other varieties didn't produce any fruit until day 56 or 57. The standard ambassador hybrid variety that I typically rely on grew as I've come to expect, producing typical shaped courgettes on a plant with a fairly open habit, which makes it easy to see and harvest the developing fruit. This plant grew an additional side shoot and had a decent yield, producing a reasonable number of fruit, which sets a baseline that I'm used to. The Atina hybrid variety had more of a trailing or vining habit, with 2 main vines developing quite quickly, which did take up a fair amount of space, though not as vigorous as some of the others, and it produced a greater number of yellow courgettes and a really high yield from the 2 vines. The open pollinated Genovese variety had a shorter vine, with the longer stems on the leaves creating a large open bush form to the plant, and it produced a good crop of pale green courgettes with a similar yield to my standard variety, which I thought was quite good for an open pollinated variety. Another yellow hybrid called Gold Rush was more compact than the other yellow variety, and was definitely a smaller plant that seemed to fit in better to the space that it had, but produced a smaller yield with fewer courgettes to harvest. The Midnight hybrid variety produced a consistent crop of dark-skinned, conventional-shaped fruit, and was also more of a compact plant with 1 vine and the leaves not spread out so much, but it produced an impressive number of nice-sized courgettes and the highest yield by a little bit. The Piccolo hybrid variety was definitely more of a vigorous vining plant, which quickly grew too large for the space and the support that I tried to give it. And a lot of the unusual ball-shaped courgettes remained hidden until they got quite big, which pushed up the yield quite a bit. The open-pollinated Romanesco variety was definitely the largest plant in the set, producing several strong vines that occupied a lot of the space, overshadowing adjacent plants, and I ended up pulling up the plant a month before the others. But up to that point, it was more productive than most of the other varieties. Another open-pollinated, Striato d'Italia, was relatively compact, but had a lot of leaves and side shoots that crowded out the center of the plant, which made it much more difficult to find all the distinctive patterned fruit before they got too big, which led to a higher yield. The last plant, Sunstripe, was also a hybrid variety that produced a later crop of distinctive yellow and white striped courgettes, and was more of a vining plant, though the main stem split midway through the season, which contributed to a lower yield. This bed of courgette plants definitely got out of hand, with the plants extending into the paths, making it hard to get around, and impacting the bean plants in the adjacent bed. This made it harder to evaluate some of the varieties, especially the ones that were overly impacted by a more vigorous neighbor, and most of the plants would probably produce differently if they were pruned and controlled a bit. I usually do a fair amount of pruning to remove the older leaves of the courgette plants in the polytunnels, to reduce the size and weight of the plants, remove leaves affected by mildew, and to increase airflow around the base to avoid some of the stem rotting that often occurs. I've also tried several different ways to train the main vines vertically up twine or posts, though I'm usually not consistent enough with this for it to be really effective, and I wonder if it would work better with different varieties. I did put in a few bamboo canes to support the growing vine of some of the different varieties in this trial, but it was not really effective, at least not without tying them up and pruning some of the older leaves. And the vines of some of the varieties grew way too long for this kind of support and would have needed to have been tied to a strong twine suspended from the polytunnel structure. I usually remove most of the side shoots from the general crops of courgette plants, and this would have changed things quite a bit in this crop, as the bed would have not been so overcrowded. In another trial in the same polytunnel this year, where I was seeing what would happen to the plants when I harvested the courgettes at different sizes, I found that the smaller I harvested the fruit, the larger the plant grew, especially with additional side shoots. And it was really interesting that the plant that had been left to grow large marrows was quite small and manageable in comparison, so that is definitely something to consider. I had also tried growing some patty pan summer squash plants in the corner of the polytunnel, which I have never grown before, and the plants grew way too big, with a really crowded center that made finding all the immature squash very difficult. This was very similar to the habit of the Striato d'Italia courgette variety, which seemed to increase the amount of mold that developed in the cramped inner part of the plant. And I suspect varieties that grow in this way are much better suited for a larger space outside and probably in a warmer and drier climate. So the more crowded or vigorous varieties were not very useful in the polytunnel, and the varieties that grew much longer vine would definitely need to be tied up vertically in some way. And it would be preferable if the plants had a more open habit or space within the leaves, as this would help to increase the airflow and reduce the possibility of molds that can be a problem in the still air of the polytunnel. And it would also make it easier to harvest. This was a small trial with only one plant of each variety and in a particular context, so things could change quite a bit with another trial. But I was quite surprised by the results, especially with the Midnight hybrid variety, which produced the most number of courgettes with the biggest total weight of a type of courgettes that many people seem to prefer. And this was from a plant that was overcrowded by a more vigorous neighbor. The significantly higher number of courgettes that this plant produced works well with my preference for harvesting small courgettes, and the plant was quite small, with the leaves not extending too far out to get in the way. This also means that it would not be so open in habit and would make it a little bit more difficult to harvest, but as the plants would be smaller, I'd probably be able to plant them a little bit closer together, which would probably increase the yields a bit. The Atina hybrid variety was also very impressive, with lots of fruit and a high yield, though it would be interesting to see how this changes if there was only one vine. The longer vine on this variety would probably benefit from being grown vertically up a twine or post, and pruning the older leaves would help to reduce the impact of the larger diameter and the weight of the plant that had to be supported. And I was also impressed how the open pollinated Genovese variety produced quite a few really nice courgettes, though not as productive as the two hybrid varieties. And this plant was not so vigorous and fairly contained, despite its long leaves and open habit. In this context of growing in the polytunnel, I think I would grow the two hybrid varieties, Midnight and Atina, as well as the open pollinated variety Genovese, as they all did well and the different colors and textures of the courgettes make a very interesting combination. If I had to pick one, it would definitely be the Midnight variety, mainly because it seemed to be so productive for a plant that was so small. But it will be interesting to see how all three of these varieties produce when they're not suffering from the competition of the more vigorous neighbors beside them. I think the two larger varieties would probably benefit from pruning and staking to control their growth so that I can get the most out of these plants without them getting in the way. But with the Midnight variety, I think it would do well in this kind of context without these extra tasks, to just let it grow without controlling the plants too much, which could save a fair amount of work. But then it depends on how long I want them to grow in this context, as there is a benefit from pulling the crop of courgettes out of the polytunnel once the plants outside in the gardens start to really produce, and then to replant with another crop later in the summers that will be able to produce well into the autumn, rather than trying to get one plant to produce for the entire long season. It will be interesting to try growing all of these varieties outside, and I might choose different ones, especially in the context where I can give each plant a lot more space. I suspect that I will end up replacing my usual variety that I grow for another variety in the outside gardens. And it will definitely be replaced for the plants in the polytunnel, especially after I've seen what other hybrid and open pollinated varieties can produce. But I am surprised that a smaller variety that was apparently bred for container growing comes out as the most appropriate choice in this context. But I guess within the warmer climate of a polytunnel, even a smaller variety can be vigorous enough. The growing season is finally starting to come to an end here in Ireland, and it's really good to be getting through a backlog of videos that I've wanted to make after a busy summer. There is so much more that I learned and explored this year that I want to share, and we're starting to do the work to overwinter the gardens and to prepare for the next season of this independent research project. I wanted to thank all those people who leave comments and share the videos that I make, and I especially want to thank all those people who continue to support me, this channel, and the broader Red Gardens project through regular donations and contributions with Patreon and one-off donations with PayPal. It would not be possible to continue with this project without you. If you want to join them, there are links to PayPal and Patreon on screen or in the description below. As the more support we can get, the more we can explore and share with everybody. But most importantly, thank you for watching.